So I'm Michael Ramos with the Church Council of Greater Seattle. So excited that you've stayed for this conversation, and we're very happy to have this conversation around racism and white privilege. And I wanted to ask my dear friends and colleagues, Karen and Linda, to take a moment to introduce themselves and maybe to reflect for a moment on what struck you from the performance in terms of taking a stand for justice. Maybe begin with you, Linda.
Okay, thank you. I'm the Reverend Dr. Linda Smith, Executive Director and Pastor of the Sky Urban Empowerment Center. I also currently serve as the President of the Church Council of Greater Seattle. And I think one of the things that really struck me was, well, there's lots of things that was pretty powerful, but it's that one person can make a difference. And particularly, I think it's not to never remain silent. I remember the words of Dr. King were ringing in my ears as I was watching the play that says, silence is a betrayal of our souls. And so to speak out and to voice our concerns about injustice really speaks volume to the transformation in our world today. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Karen, and I'm with the Breaking White Silence Project. But whenever I'm in some kind of challenging situation around social justice, I like to wear this T-shirt that I bought when I was in when I went to a civil rights pilgrimage in 2017 to the Deep South, and I met the woman on this T-shirt, Annie Pearl Avery. When I first met her, she said, "Google me, I'm a legend," which she is. It says a living legend. So there's also Fannie Lou Hamer, a quote from Fannie Lou Hamer, and she said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," and a quote from Ella Baker, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes." And so these three leaders and activists in the civil rights movement have inspired me a lot, because like Sophie Scholl, they risked their lives in order to work for justice. And so that's why I like, and I'd probably wear a T-shirt for Sophie Scholl if you had one. And I mean, this play is so profound. It's going to really stick with me. I think it's always going to stick with me, because it just shows how we, as ordinary people, can be challenged to like dig really deep into ourselves and then find that moral ground that will move us to act and to do something, like even just take another step. Because as she says, evil flourishes. We are we are complicit if we don't say or do something. And tonight we're going to be talking about the evil of racism, and that's really true about racism, right? So I really look forward to having more conversation with you all. So thank you.
Thank you. Would you be willing to share a little bit about your own experience in working for racial justice?
Yes, so I guess my own experience in terms of working for racial justice, I like to always start by saying it's really personal for me. I grew up in the South, grew up in Arkansas, and really just suffered some of the most severe dehumanizing treatment because of racism. And so I've sort of personally taken on this plight to really be a voice for those who are marginalized by our society because of race. I've worked particularly around issues, people that are marginalized by homelessness, but homelessness is just one aspect of it, because from homelessness, people are denied so many other rights for the gift of life. I worked tireless, just advocating and being that voice, because as I reflect on my own personal experience, is that when you're marginalized, when you're suppressed by racism, and it's very difficult. You don't have a voice, really, because your voice has been taken away from you because of things like racism. I've worked with our local police department in bringing about change, being a voice for those who are marginalized and because of their race with the police department. And many other areas working particularly, in groups, and always making racial justice a part of the conversation. I worked in corporate America for many years, and part of my job as HR director was always to keep the issue around racial justice at the forefront of management and how they were dealing with employees because of racism. So I just, my whole life, and I think when we talk about racism and raising our voice, each one of us can really make a difference. We can make a choice. I think the play really clearly demonstrated that we can choose to be silent or we can sacrifice. I mean, there's a sacrifice. When you speak up against things like racism, there is a sacrifice. But it's a sacrifice that's well worth it, because what you're doing is giving life. And I believe that every person is entitled to the gift of life. Thank you.
Karen.
Wow, thank you. Well, for many, many years, I have worked also with folks who are on the margins, in domestic violence shelters, in jails. And the last 10 years of my working life was with families who are homeless through Compass Housing Alliance. And the families I worked with were disproportionately people of color. And oftentimes, people would tell me about some of the microaggressions that they experience, which are, if you don't know, there's like slights and insults that people endured throughout any day that white people would probably not notice. And they also shared with me all the discrimination that they experienced in the various systems that they had to integrate, not integrate, but interact with. So I kind of, I came to the conclusion that, like, poverty, one of the root causes of poverty is racism. And I was really disturbed, distressed, and pained by the experiences of the folks that I worked alongside with. And so I was just like really wondering, what could I do? What could I do? So I went to a rally in 2014 after the death of Michael Brown. And actually, you were a speaker there, Michael, if you remember that. Anyway, afterwards, I started talking with the Reverend Harriet Walden. Now, Reverend Walden, she co-founded Mothers for Police Accountability over 25 years ago. Anyway, so we were talking, and she says, I appreciate your coming down here and being an ally. However, the way you could best help my people is go back into your community and talk to white people about racism. Change their hearts and minds. And at the time, I don't know what my face showed, but I was kind of like, I could feel my heart just sort of sinking. It just wasn't what I was expecting. But I thanked her, and then I really grappled with that. At least for like a week, I was talking to people, reflecting on it, and I thought, oh my gosh. And then it's interesting, one day I just woke up and I had such clarity. I said, Karen, you have been given a mission by someone you really respect. You need to do this, figure it out. So I just set about just going to trainings and reading blogs, diversifying my Facebook. I just was very, I need to educate myself as to how to do this. So the PNA had a series of programs called Difficult Conversations About Race. So I went to that whole series, and one of the presenters was Dr. Robin DiAngelo. Now, I have a master's degree in social work, and we learned a lot about how racism affects people of color, but we really learned kind of superficially about how white people are elevated by racism. And so when she started talking about white identity, that was really new for me, especially the way that she framed it. I had no idea it was so multidimensional, how deep it was. And it was such an aha moment for myself and Cecily Kaplan, who's not here. She's the director of the Greenwood Senior Center, but she and I were looking at each other, we're going, wow, we had just such an aha moment. And so we started talking about we need to do something about this. This is really important information for white people. Because we don't realize that we are, as white people, if we're unaware, we don't realize how we are part of racism, and how we do harm just from our ignorance. So we decided, well, let's start some study groups using her book. What does it mean to be white? Developing white racial literacy. And so we invited some folks that we knew, and we got together and we decided to call our group Breaking White Silence. And that was like really, really important. That comes from a quote by Alicia Garza, who is the co-founder of Black Lives Matter. She said, "We need to change the narrative of white supremacy and change white supremacy by breaking white silence." So that is what we are doing, and we're in the 3rd year of our project. And there'll be some information that if you are interested in being a study group, it will be on our resource list.
Well, thank you. Thank you for deepening all our understanding around these issues, and the call each as individuals to follow the path that we're called to be able to respond, to act responsibly in the face of racism within our community. The evangelical preacher Jim Wallace calls racism America's original sin. And I'd like each of you to have a chance to reflect on that for a moment and your views on confronting racism as America's original sin and addressing white privilege and making racial justice a way of life.
Yeah.
Do you want me to start this time? Okay. Well, I'll just say this. At another rally I went to, I heard this young speaker. She made 2 statements I will never forget. The first statement she made was, "White silence is killing us." The second statement she said was, "Racism is white people's problem that affects black people." So the first statement, that white silence is killing us, is like, oh my gosh, racism has been killing black people and people of color ever since they came to this country. And how we are seeing it right now is lower life expectancy, lower infant mortality, higher rate of death among black women giving birth. Of course, the police profiling and killing young black men and in some cases women. And mass incarceration, higher stress level from racism, and really poverty. So it's clear that, and the other statement that racism is white people's problem, and so because it is our problem, we do need to stand up because it's obvious. I think we all actually know in our hearts that racism harms and actually kills just the hope, and we know that. So, but what I do know though is we need to really understand this. We need to really understand our privilege, and that's why we have these study groups, so that we have a framework and a language so that we can talk about it. That's what I learned. Like when they say, well, go home and talk to your uncle who says a racist joke or something. But if you don't really understand deeply about it, I mean, it's actually, I see as a skill to learn how to talk to people about racism, right? Other white people in particular. So I just cannot say too much about how we need to educate ourselves.
So I think one of the important part about confronting racism as our country original sin is, the adage says that when we know better, we do better. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to confront the original sin because historically, we have to go back and look at the injustices that brought about racism and how racism has just ingrained itself within our society and how it continues to perpetuate itself in the minds of people. So history, I think, is really important in terms of eradicating racism. I think we can't, if we don't go back and address the original sin of racism, I think we're just coding it. And I know that it's sometimes very difficult work and difficult conversation. I always like to say, and Michael knows this, as I'm talking to groups, particularly whites, is I don't hold you responsible for the things that happen in history. But what I hold you responsible for as white people is not being able to recognize and come in face to face with the truth of those social ills that impacted people. Because it does us no good for white people to walk around feeling guilty about what happened in the past. But what does us good is when you can come face to face with the truth and say, okay, this is what happened. Now, what do we do differently as we move forward in the future to embrace a new way of life? And, I believe there are lots of good white folks out there that are trying to do the right thing. Matter of fact, my own personal story is there were a couple of good white people who really saw the impact of racism on our family that helped us to get out of Arkansas. and that's because they saw the impacts of what the racism had on us. So I think that's really important. And that to me is what really addressed white privilege. And that's why it's important. And that to me makes it a way of life, making racism racial justice a way of life. Because everything we look at, we should always look at it through the lens of race. Is how does race impact this? And when we start to look at it from that particular perspective, I think it really changes and helps transform the way we live as a people. I really like the play that talked about religion. As a pastor, spirituality is really important, and I think it's a personal thing for each one of us. Of course, there's the systematic, there's the institutional, but personally, as each of us take on our personal responsibility to learn that history, to know that history, then we do something different. And religion is really not a passive, but it's active, and our action it really comes out of how we're transformed personally.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask one more.
Can I add something
Sure,
just
course,
quickly? So Dr. D'Angelo really emphasizes that we are all socialized into this system we didn't ask to be socialized into. So and not to feel guilt as a result of that.
Right, absolutely.
But to educate ourselves and act is really important. And the other piece I want to make sure is that I want to be really clear to say that racism harms white people. And I think that is a really important point, and that it dehumanizes us. I believe it causes a pain to our soul we may be aware of or not be aware of. And I just really want to make that point because we are all harmed by racism. And so really I'm doing this for myself. I'm working for liberation for myself, and I believe our liberation is all bound up with each other's. So I just think that's real important. It is really about me and us, and yeah.
So before we get to a few minutes of Q&A, I do want to ask one more question, and I might get myself in a little bit of trouble in asking this, but as Seattleites, we often think we're so progressive and we have our act together, and that racism is something that we don't have to deal with in Seattle. So I'd like to hear each of your thoughts about that statement. Does racism still need to be confronted in our community?
Oh, yes.
You want to start?
I want to start on that one. I'll be bold, I'll step out. And I think the reason in Seattle where it's a dangerous place because there's lots of money here. There's lots of money. And we can sometimes use our money. Money relates to power. And it has a way of elevating itself to an artificial perception that I'm feeding crumbs to people, but you're not really addressing the issues behind why we are where we are. And when you start to look at the data, you see that race is so prominent in terms of the racial issues that we're experiencing in many of the areas that we're experiencing. So the money sort of gives us this artificial perception that we are good people here, and we do some good things here, but it can also be a real danger because we're not really dealing with the real issues of racism. Why is it that we don't have affordable housing for everyone? Why is it that we don't have medical care and good care for certain groups of people? Why is it that we redline certain areas and certain people are not able to afford housing? why is it that we're allowing immigrant kids to be locked up in cages in our city? So, so the money's sort of like, we got so much money, we're building all these buildings and things, but we're not getting to the root of why these things are happening to us. So,
Thank you.
Well, I guess what I'll add is I took a training from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, which I recommend to everyone because they focus on systemic racism. And so within that training, we studied the systems and institutions in Seattle and came to the conclusion none of them are equitable. So every system and institution in Seattle is as racist as any system or institution in any city in this entire country. And the way I was sort of thinking about it, like if we were really progressive, then the people in this city, we would have spoke out against it, and that would not be the case. But it is the case. The other thing is if you Google Black in Seattle, oh my gosh. And I had already kind of known this because I'd heard people talk about it, but many Black people who have come here and left because it feels very unwelcome to them. It's a very unwelcome space. It's kind of like racism won't be named, and that's actually more difficult than in other cities where it's more, people talk about it or it's more obvious. And I think that's very telling, very telling. And anyway, yeah. What else to say? Oh, I know, I sort of wanted to say a little bit about you. So thinking about the system, so since every system is inequitable, so I wanted to say like in our education system, there was research, Stanford researchers said that in Seattle, Black children are 3.7 years behind white children. That's systemic racism. I know about, housing discrimination, families I've worked on. Our police department was being monitored by the Department of Justice for excessive force. And I believe they have come to the end of that. But before then, Charlene Lyles was killed. Massive gentrification in the Central District and south of Seattle. So it's really important for us to actually think of it systemically when we think of racism, because there's one author I really love, Ijeoma Oluo, and she says, I don't really care if you like me, but I want to be able to get jobs, I want to be able to get housing, I want to be able to get education. Those are really important to me. That's what helps me thrive. So I think the importance of work for us to figure out how we can work on systems is really important. And the way I think about it is, since every system is inequitable, as white people, we choose a system and with other folks join and pick a part of it, that is inequitable and work on that, so it doesn't seem so huge. But if we're all doing something, that is like the important thing, that all of it, justice means just us.
Thank you.
I know other people have said that before, it's not new, but actually Nikita Oliver and Sister Helen Prajid of Dead Man Walking, two places I've heard that.
Well, thank you both for the depth of your responses and the heart and soul with which you live this work of racial justice. Take a few minutes for questions. If anyone has a question, feel free to speak it out loud. So our friend who asked a question, she mentioned that she's a Quaker and asked about reparations, and for the panelists to respond about the call to reparations and their thoughts on that.
Well, I think reparation for African Americans is because we're probably one of the only groups that has not happened for. I think that's crucial in terms of redemption. I think it's important to. I think it heals an old wound. It says that you really are important, and actually just having a conversation with someone about that today. So I think that's an important part of us moving forward in this country, to make amends for the things that have been done wrong in the past. And that, to me, brings sort of some sense of equity amongst people. And then I think that gives us a great opportunity to be able to move forward in a more powerful and transforming way.
Thank you. Karen, would you like to?
Wow, just today someone sent me an article about the FOR, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, who are also doing some programs around reparation, but I didn't read it yet. I wished I had. But I really
Yeah,
believe,
it's good.
I really believe in the idea of reparations. So personally, Karen Schneider, I think about reparations a lot. This isn't exactly the same, but like for Native Americans, by the way, we are on the land, we are on stolen grounds of the Duwamish people. So there's a program called Real Rent Duwamish, where, where you can pay every month. Like, it's kind of a sense of reparation, or so that we can pay for the rent of being on their land. Like, personally, I try to frequent Black businesses and support the African American Museum, send money to candidates of color who are running that I support. Like, I have sort of my own way of thinking about doing reparations, but I totally believe in the grander picture of doing something like from the government. But I think about it even from myself on my own personal level, because I think it's hugely important.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, please. Beautiful question around
You wrote that in the Birmingham jail.
the detrimental effects of the moderate and the reaction of the panelists to the concept of moderation and what it does to feed racism, and quoting Dr. King in his letter from Birmingham jail around the white moderate and sort of sanctioning the continuance of segregation and denial of civil rights within our land.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think it sort of it speaks for itself, really, if you think about it. As you were asking that question, I was thinking about just the economical impact of racism on, African Americans and people of color, and particularly African Americans, because one of the things for us is that we have never gained parity. So white moderates really it's sort of like they are complicit. I mean, and I guess, and the question was, what can they do?
Just what can white people in general do to combat that and to not become a white moderate?
Well, I think for me is to continue to face the truth about what's going on. Most of all, being an ally, speaking up, not being afraid. Even if it's just that one person taking a stance. Really, and I see a lot of that's happening. Particularly, with the millennials. I think they're just doing an amazing job of out there on the front lines and saying no to the racial injustice that's taken place. And so I think it's just more of that, and the education piece, and really encouraging people to speak up and not be silent. I think that's the only way we're going to change it. Is to never don't crawl in a hole. Keep naming the injustice. As I think about as a pastor, is always talking about those injustices. Because if you never talk about injustice, if you've never named them, justice will never be realized. And as Karen said earlier, injustice has hurt us all. So even though, it seems like, whites have the dominant power and you're not impacted by it, yes you are. Because the world has changed. And I also think about my grandson who, most of his friends, he has a mixture of friends. He have all kinds of friends. He have black friends, he have Asian friends, he have white friends. And so we don't live in the world that we used to live in. And so part of what we all need to do is come along with the young people and say, we can live in this world together. We can all have equality of life, and we can all enjoy the gift of life that we're all entitled to.
Right.
I'm not sure that answered your question, but
Thank
it's
you.
just
I have a thought. Here's a thought. I really love studying the civil rights history, and I just really love studying history because I think that's like a really important thing that white people need to do. So in context, that letter from Birmingham Birmingham jail, when he talked about moderates at that time, he felt like he needed to do a really strong campaign in Birmingham because he was losing the attention of the world. So the moderates at that time, where the ministers were saying, no, slow down.
Yeah.
You know, we
Yeah.
can't do that. You know, you can't do civil disobedience. We got to, we got to just, we want to keep white people engaged. There's this whole idea of like keeping white people comfortable, and which is part of our socialization as white people. Like, we don't want to bring up race. We don't want to call somebody when they say a joke or say something stereotypic. But the problem with not confronting that is that it keeps it circulating in our society, and it has real world consequences. So when you hear people say jokes that reinforce stereotypes or any kind of thing, if you don't really talk about how that's a harmful stereotype, and if it, and because it's circulating in our society, a black man might not be able to get a job because of these stereotypes that we perpetuate. So the speaking up actually is a very, very important thing. And again, studying is so important. Education around how to do that is just so important. And anyway.
I want to give our speakers 1 minute each to remarks, and then I'm going to take 1 minute.
Okay. So my 1 minute, I'd like to just say into relationship to what she just said. I think it's important for us to walk in the midst of people. Howard Thurman writes a book entitled Jesus and the Disinherit. And one of the principles that he talked about is fear. Fear is what divides us. So when we can get out, and I love that what her father did, what her mother did. When we can get out amongst people of different races, we don't fear them. I mean, fear keeps us divided, and it keeps us, in places that is not good for any of us. So I think just letting down our guards and really knowing that I want the same thing that you want, and that is life. And to have a happy life and a safe and secure place to live. And I think that's what most of us want. So just, acknowledging there's nothing to fear from each other. We're all human beings.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I like that. And so Dr. D'Angelo says one of the biggest manifestations of racism is segregation, that we all live very segregated lives. And I think the idea that we get to know other people and broaden our lenses and our experiences and our worldview is hugely important. And I kind of wanted to end with a thought by Ijeoma Oluo, again, who I highly recommend her book, So You Want to Talk About Race. Very practical suggestions. And she says, if you are not willing to have these painful conversations, if you are not willing to act, then that means you are leaving the burden of race on people of color. I was like, whoa, when I read that, I said, that's true.
Thank you.
Because we're all in this together, folks.
Yeah.
We're all in this together, right? Yeah.
Thank you. And by way of concluding, I just want to add a word from the religion writer Karen Armstrong, who spoke here in Seattle several years ago and said that compassionate cities are uncomfortable cities. And we need to get a little bit uncomfortable to address white privilege and racism in our midst. And it is not just a practice of one action. It is a practice of a way of life. And so we each have our own ways to discover that, but it has to do with relationships, and it has to do with encounter, and it has to do with getting out of our comfort zones. And it has to do with acts of love. And in confronting racism, we are actually acting lovingly within our own community. And it means also discovering some truths about ourselves, about our institutions, and about our communities, and a commitment to work toward the transformation at all levels. And in doing that, we believe that love wins, and that we will find ourselves as a community. And until we do that, we still have a long ways to go in Seattle and in Western Washington. So I want to thank Linda.
Thank you.
I want to thank you, Karen. Wonderful conversation, and thank all of you.